one of the things we study is religion. And so it was really interesting for me as a Christian to study religion using different models. And one of the ones that is used to understand faith is that it's a psychological thing, so it's a psychological illusion. And you can see in the work of academics like Feuerbach and Freud, you may have heard of Freud. So they argue that rather than humans being created in God's image, actually it's humans who create God in their image. So they turn it around and claim that we project our idealized versions of humanity into the heavens, that we project our wishes onto God. So Feuerbach actually said, man is the beginning, the center, and the end of religion. Freud, who is the Austrian psychologist, took this further. So he described God as the ultimate wish fulfillment, above all other wish fulfillments. His theory was that when we're children, it's our fathers who give us love and protection in the world. But as we grow up, we can't rely on them anymore. And so we create a kind of divine father figure who offers that same kind of love and protection. But it's an illusion. It gives us assurance, but it's not really real. You may have heard similar objections, or you may yourself have the objection that Christianity is for weak people. It's a way of kind of escaping from the realities of life. You may not be very opposed to it. You may say to your friends, it's great for you, but we just know it's not true, even if it helps you. So I think there's lots of ways we come across this argument, isn't there? Another one that I've heard is from kind of evolutionary theory, that religion is kind of, it's like a hangover from our past, that at one point it was useful for humans, maybe to deal with the fear of death or the uncertainties of life when we didn't understand, but now it's redundant and we know we've kind of grown out of it, we no longer need it. So what can we say about this? Is God just the longing of the human soul personified? Have Christians kind of failed to catch up with a scientific understanding of the world? And is faith in God simply a way for weak people to try and cope with the harsh reality of life? Maybe these are some of your questions. I think the first thing to say is that claiming Christians believe in God just because they want it to be true, while it's a simple argument, is one that can just as easily be turned around. You could argue in the same vein that an atheist doesn't believe in God because they don't want it to be true. It's interesting, an American philosopher called Thomas Nagel wrote this in a moment of honesty. I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. There could be many reasons for this. Maybe he doesn't want to be held morally accountable. Maybe he doesn't want to go back on what he said his whole life. Now, of course, I know this isn't the case for everybody, and I've had friends who've said to me, Emily, I do want to believe, but I just haven't found enough evidence for it. I haven't found enough good reasons. If you're in that position, this is a great week for you, because the sea is very openly giving you the opportunity to explore, and it's going to give you ways to try and find those reasons and find that evidence. I think it's also worth pointing out, right from the beginning, that while it's true that things don't exist simply because we wish them to exist, it doesn't follow that just because we desire something, it doesn't exist. That's a logical fallacy, and it doesn't really get us any closer to understanding whether God is real or not. I think it's also interesting that universally and throughout history, there seems to be this natural desire in humans for there to be something more than the material, for there to be something supernatural or spiritual. You can go anywhere in the world and you'll find those kind of beliefs. Now, when you look at most kind of innate natural desires that humans are born with, it's because such a thing exists to satisfy that desire. So I'm born desiring food, such a thing as food exists. Or I'm born desiring sex, such a thing as sex exists. It doesn't mean that you're going to get it whenever you want it, but it exists. That desire can be fulfilled. So is God the only desire, natural desire of humans, for which the fulfillment doesn't exist? It's an interesting question. I also think that, say for a moment, there is a God. It's not really surprising that we should desire to know him. And it's not surprising that if he did create us, that he should create us with the desire and the capacity to know him, that he should want us to relate to him in some way. I think there's also a false assumption underlying some of these objections, that Christians are subject to psychological factors and to a kind of bias, whereas an atheist is neutral and objective in their reasoning. In reality, we're all influenced by different psychological factors and biases depending on our upbringing or our education. We all start with assumptions. But I don't believe that we're incapable of looking and examining and critically thinking about truth and coming to conclusions. So I think we start on more of a common ground than we think. It's also interesting to note that there are many Christians who believe, not because they desired it to be true, but because they found it was, and because they found that it was both intellectually and emotionally satisfying. This includes many eminent historians, scientists, philosophers. Take, for example, C.S. Lewis, the Oxford scholar and famous author. C.S. Lewis was an atheist into his adult life. And he didn't want to believe that Christianity was true. He resisted it for a long time. But eventually he was compelled by the weight of evidence to surrender to God and say, yes, it is true. But in his own description of his conversion, he describes himself as the most reluctant convert in all of England. His conviction was intellectual before it was emotional, although that's important and came later. I also spoke to a student in Exeter last month, and she was telling me that she became a Christian a year ago. And she said, you know, sometimes I hear about dramatic conversion stories where somebody's a drug addict or on the brink of death and then they become a Christian. And she said, for me, it wasn't like that. I didn't feel I needed God. I didn't feel weak. I was really happy. My life was content. But I found that the claims of Jesus were true. And so I knew I had to accept them. So it's not necessarily that you have to be weak and desperate before you come to God. So I think this brings us to the fact that it's the truth claims of Christianity that you need to respond to, not your emotional reaction to the idea of there being a God. And when you look at Christianity and you look at Jesus, it's striking just how unexpected he is, how kind of counterintuitive he is. If you were going to invent a God and invent a religion, would you really invent Jesus? Unlike most of the world's religions, Christianity is not based on God giving a moral system so that humans can get to him, sort of like climbing a ladder into heaven by good works. It's not saying that we can be accepted by God on our own merit. Rather, it's a message of scandalous grace, that God in his holiness could not be satisfied by human efforts, but in love stepped into human history to make humanity acceptable to God through his death. I think in our culture, we've become really familiar with the symbol of Jesus on a cross. We see that image in art, we see it in films, And I think we've become slightly numb to it, slightly numb to how scandalous, how shocking, and even how offensive it is. Jesus on a cross, when you look at that, that's saying that the immortal God became mortal. It's saying that God himself suffered and died. That he died alone, shamed, naked, in an execution. And often it's only when I speak to people from other countries or other religions that I'm reminded again just how shocking this message is, because I've got so used to it. And when you look at Jesus, he kind of turns your expectations of what God should be like upside down. He wasn't a political, military leader. He didn't show his power in that way. His power was in giving rather than taking. He challenged people to do things like love their enemies. His harshest words were for the religious elite, and his kindest for outcasts and the lowest of society. And he didn't live a successful life according to the world's standards. He never had a house. He never earned loads. He never had the recognition that he should have had in his time. And ultimately, when you look at the cross, when you look at the immortal dying, it's just, a Muslim friend once said to me, I find it offensive. I find it deeply offensive that you would claim that God would die. And I think, who would make that up? And I think sometimes we also think the first century Jews, the ones who followed Jesus, who knew him, who saw his life, were just more easily persuaded that it was part of their worldview that somebody could die and rise from the dead. But when you look at the accounts of Jesus' life, there's one on your chair you can look at later. Jesus told his followers over and over, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die, and I'm going to rise again. You think they would get it, but they didn't. They didn't believe him. In fact, Peter, who was the mouthy one, said to him, shut up, basically. Don't say it. It's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. They just didn't expect it. And when Jesus did die, it didn't seem like a victory to them. It seemed like all their hopes were over. That this man who claimed to be God, that it just wasn't true. It was a tragedy. It was the end. And when the first reports of his resurrection were coming around, they didn't believe it either. He didn't seem like a hero, that figure dying on a cross. And they didn't believe that people rose from the dead. Sometimes we have a bit of chronological snobbery. We think that maybe people in the first century were just really superstitious and easily fooled. But when the disciples heard about Jesus rising, they said, I'm not going to believe it until I touch him. They were down-to-earth fishermen. They weren't people who were conned. They believed because they found it to be true, not because it was easy. And the consequence of Jesus' death and resurrection and their faith wasn't quite what you expect either, if this is a religion for weak people or a crutch. Jesus didn't bring them political liberation, health, wealth, prosperity, comfort. Instead, he brought them something that was even greater, not a change of their circumstances, but that God himself would be there with them. His challenge to them was, take up your cross and follow me. So Christianity isn't like a fairy tale. You don't wrap yourself in cotton wool. It deals with the reality of life by knowing God and knowing that that's worth more than anything. So when the disciples committed to trusting Jesus and to building the church, and when Christians do today, they may face hard times and ultimately will die. But I think this shows that it's not an escape from reality, it's not an illusion, but rather it's a commitment to truth no matter what. So my challenge to you is, how much do you care about truth? Maybe you think this is all rubbish, or maybe you're just unsure. But I would ask you, is that because you don't want it to be true? Or is it because you've carefully examined the evidence, in particular, looked at Jesus' life, his death and his resurrection, and come to the conclusion that it's not true? I would say before you reject something, make sure you know what it is you're rejecting. The great thing about Christianity is that it's not a philosophy or a moral system. It's based on a person and historical events. So it opens itself up to that kind of questioning. It opens itself up to investigation. So you can. There's several ways you can do that this week. The Christian Union has put on a great week answering some of the toughest questions, so you can come along and hear them. At 1 o'clock after this, my colleague Michael's going to be talking about the evidence for Christianity, for that God actually exists. So you can stay and listen to that as well. And on your chairs are these books called Uncover. This is one of the accounts of Jesus' life, written by a man who interviewed the eyewitnesses, and it's a great place to start reading and seeing for yourself. So in a minute we're going to have questions. I hope you've been thinking of questions, but while you're thinking of them, I'll give you a few minutes to get the brain going. There are these little forms on your seats. We'd love to know what you thought of the event and any comments you have. There's also a box you can tick that says "Tell me more." If you think you'd like to explore more about Jesus and who he was and what he did, and you'd like some help to do that, you'd like to do it with people, the Christian Union are going to be doing some events in the next few weeks looking at Jesus' life